Thank you very much, Rachel, for that introduction. And of course, it's a great honor to be asked to give the Keynes lecture, and it's a pretty daunting task as well to address such a mixed audience, people who are expert in economics and people who we're going to become expert, I hope, at the end of this lecture. This is a lecture, Keynes lecture has been going since 1971, so I feel like I'm one of an illustrious group who's been asked to give this lecture. Excuse me, organize my things. I chose this, I should also apologize, my voice is going to come and go, so I hope everyone will be able to follow. I chose this fake woodcut from the 19th century to introduce my models talk, because it seems to capture something of the way that other social scientists view economists. And other social scientists view economists with quite a lot of suspicion because they sort of think that economists picture imagined worlds which they know, other social scientists know don't really exist. They have this fictional quality which other social scientists find a little bit difficult or a little bit odd, and that's one of the things I want to talk about is quite what kind of fictional elements are going on in economic models and how economists reason with them. I've also chosen it because this is a new, recent idea that has come into philosophy of science, that we should think of models as fictions. And this is particularly sort of fashion almost amongst younger philosophers of science, particularly my colleague Roman Frigg, who's here, Adam Toon, and a number of other younger colleagues. So the idea is that we can think of the models of economics, diagrams, equations, etc., as props in a game of make-believe. And economists then prescribe or imagine a world in the model. They don't make a model to represent the world we live in. They imagine a world, which they then, as it were, picture or write down in this model. And as all games of make-believe, there are rules of playing the game, and playing the game with a model in economics, those rules are set by the medium of the model, the kind of object it is, whether it's made of equations or diagrams or a hydraulic model, and the facts of the subject matter. So there's a constraint on the kinds of things that you can imagine. So you can't, for instance, imagine that people live negative lives because that's just a fiction too far. So there's some constraints from facts, but there's a lot of the rules are set by the kind of medium that the model is made of. And then what happens is that economists use these models, they explore these imagined worlds to find out how it works and its limits, and thus what happens in using the model is to make truths about this imagined world. So that may not be exactly how the philosophy of fictions conceives of it, but that's sort of to use the philosophy of fictions, of models as fictions idea, to try and address the kinds of things I want to address and the kinds of things I talked about in the book on models. So the questions I want to address in this lecture are, what kinds of imaginings are going on here? Do models as fictions, if we think of them as fictions, prescribe imagined worlds? That is, are they really a science fiction activity? Or do they, as it were, offer imaginative accounts of the real world that we live in? The difference, I think, is a little bit difficult to draw in some sense. I mean, we might think we know the difference between science fiction and an imaginative account. Excuse me. I like to think of a friend of mine who has a 3-year-old who at the moment is seeing dragons everywhere. Every corner that she goes around, she's doubtful about, there's a dragon in the corner. If a cobweb grabs her hair, it's a dragon mummy. But this is kind of science fiction. I mean, maybe for a 3-year-old, dragons are pretty real, but this seems to be very much in the science fiction mode. As opposed to the usual example of science models as fictions is the taking of tree stumps in a forest to be a bear. So children playing a game about bears in the forest, either they're hunting them or they're running away from them, will see tree stumps as bears. So one could make a slight distinction here between the dragon's example of science fiction and the bears in the forest, which is using these tree stumps as props, as being an imagined account of the world that at least children in America grew up in, not ones here, because we don't have bears in our forests. But so it seems as facts only come into the second kind of fictions, games of bears versus games of dragons. But I think that's not always evident that's so. So one of the second question I want to play around with here is how do facts and fictions interrelate in the construction and use of models and the prescribed imaginings that are supposed to go on, assuming that we take models as fictions. The third idea I want to address is, are fictions really the best way to think about economic models, or would artifacts be a more helpful label for what they are and how they're used? I'm going to put aside that particular idea and come back to it later on, because I want to talk, first of all, about this issue about imaginings. So, in the restaurant at the end of the universe, in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Ford, one of the main characters, meets an old friend, Hot Black Desiato. He's sitting at a table, he won't speak to him, although he's an old friend, and he's minded by some heavies. And after many attempts to speak to Hot Black Desiato, a minder says he's spending a year dead for tax purposes, which is a wonderful kind of idea that maybe you can imagine economists might have in their model. Now, here's another example. This is Edgeworth, a famous economist of the 19th century, in a book called Mathematical Psychics, which sounds not unlike The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he writes there, to gather up and fix our thoughts, let us imagine a simple case. Robinson Crusoe contracting with Friday. Represent Y, the labour given by Friday, by a horizontal line, and measure X, the remuneration given by Crusoe. Then any points between these lines represents a contract. Now, that second quote is the introduction to the beginning of a very famous model in economics called the Edgeworth box, which I'm not going to go into because it's a wonderful object, but it takes a lot of explaining. But I want you to see the same structure of argument going on in both of these. That there's an imagination going on in order to create that model in the second place, and there's an imagination that is clearly driving through the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy example, but somehow it seems almost too real. I mean, being dead for a year takes a bit too far, but people do go away and leave the country for a year for tax purposes, so it's just a step farther than that. But it's not always easy to tell what it is that we should be concentrating on here. One's tendency is to think any name Hot Black Desiato must be a fictional character. But in fact, when we were buying our first house in Islington, we often went to see an estate agent called Hot Black and Desiato. There were two, there were Hot Black and Desiato, but we never met Mr. Desiato. We only met Mr. Hot Black, and there were various stories circulating, and perhaps he was away for a year for tax purposes. Robinson Crusoe is an even more interesting case about what's fact and fiction here. So Robinson Crusoe is written by Daniel Defoe as if it were a news account of something that happened in the day, written up to be a novel about the day. Right? So we've already got several layers where we're not sure what's fact and fiction. Well, it's a novel, so Robinson Crusoe must be made up. But in fact, it turns out that probably he's based on a Scottish sailor called Alexander Selkirk, who was abandoned on an island off Chile, 700 kilometers off Chile, in 1704, and then picked up in 1709 by a passing ship. So, and we know that this was a big news item in London of the day before Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe. So both of these examples are a little bit opaque between the facts and the fictions. I think they raise the question, what is it that matters about these fictions? Is it that the objects, the people in them are fictional, or that the situations are fictional, or the actions attributed to these people are fictional, or the stories told about them are fictional? I mean, which matters for us thinking about economics? I want to raise the question, in a sense, as to what it is and where we might find fictions and where they're going to matter, and to see how it is they come into models and the way the models get used in answering questions to give us some insight. So there's going to be 3 examples I'm going to work through of model usage, each of which has a what-if quality, part of the fictional apparatus that economists typically use. One is where we're imagining fictional worlds with facts and models, and that's a famous case, perhaps the most famous counterfactual in economic history of Vogel's counterfactual. A second case in which we're going to look at a very standard model in economics, the supply and demand model, where the fictional models are used to define what facts are economically interesting and to try and locate facts in the world. And thirdly, a splicing of facts into fiction in model creation and usage in the Newland-Phillips machine. Now, the first of these examples, I want to start off by talking about what was there before the counterfactual. In the old economic history, factual history, railroads were considered to be absolutely indispensable to the growth of the US economy, not just its growth, but its development, where people settled, what they did, how regions grew up, what kind of an economy it turned out. And a standard, actually I think a very good example of this is a paper by a historian called Leland Jenks in 1944, who talked about the railroad as an invention with three domains of impact. As an idea, where communities were building ahead of demand, that is, before the railroad even came, people were settling where it was planned to be, the development of real estate, towns, communities, new regions, new industries, and so forth. Secondly, as a construction enterprise, that is, actually building the railway, the effect on the factors of production, new laborers, wages, the demand for raw materials, all the multiplier effects that happen as a result of those demands, the effect on banking and finance as those big investments had to be financed. And then only finally, as a producer of new transport services which had new characteristics of allowing, for instance, refrigerated trucks which allowed agriculture to specialize in different new goods further away from the urban centers. New organizations, very, very large organizations, new entrepreneurs, and, at least if we believe Chandler, the development of managerial capitalism. Leland Jenks' article is narrative-informed but economic analytical in content. It's an old-fashioned, in that sense, piece of economic history compared to what was about to come along instead. So the new economic history started off with a counterfactual assessment of the railroad's indispensability, and it was particularly, the most interesting work is done by Robert Vogel, who said, well, you know, this sounds like it's okay, but really, do we know that it made such a difference? Why should we believe that it made such a difference? What if there had been no railroad in the US before 1890? And he set about trying to measure the effect, if there had been no railroad in the USA before 1890, by figuring out the transport costs of moving all the stuff that was produced, and that is in fact agricultural goods produced, from the farms to the point of final shipment. This, of course, was an immense task, right? Just to try and figure out what all those transport costs were. There's 4.5 million farms, so you've got to figure out the costs of all the transport from all those farms. And even if he only took account, as he did, for four main commodities, corn, wheat, pork, and beef, he found that that was an immense task to do, but it still only saved 2.8% of GDP. That is, if you had no railroads, you would have been 2.8% less well off as an economy in 1890 than you were, which is nothing, 1 year's growth. Right? So a big effort, factual effort, to prove that actually the railroads didn't make much difference. But he thought this was still an overestimate. Because, of course, if you took away the railroads, people wouldn't have settled where they settled and wouldn't be shipping stuff from where they shipped it to the markets. They would be somewhere else. So Vogel imagined and designed an entire alternative transport system that might have developed in the absence of railroads, right, in order to properly measure the impact that the railroads had. Of course, there's lots of other ways of following up Jenks's initial set of ideas. This is just one. He's just taking one little bit of the transport services and ignoring all the rest. So it's only a small part of the counterfactual. Well, of course, before the railroads came along, there were canals and there were waterways, and the rivers had been improved to get access to quite a lot of the land that was cultivatable. So this is a map he drew of the existing land which could still be cultivated in 1890, assuming no railroads. Right? So there's 24% of the cultivatable land which wasn't developed, which would not have been developed if there had been no railroads. But of course, if there had been no railroads, there would have been some other kind of activities going on. So Vogel designed 5,022 new miles of canals and waterways. And you have on your left a map of the new bits that would fill in some of that space. A lot of that space, of course, is mountainous, but would fill in some of that space. And you have on the right-hand side all his canal drawings, so all the canals he planned, and he looked at the falls and how long they had to be. So some of them, this one in the middle, that's a 300-mile canal, and you can see the rises and falls, and many of these are much less onerous than the canals that actually were built before the railroads came along. So there's 5 pages of new canals to fill in this map on the left. Now, having these additional waterways, which he claimed would have been there in this imagined economy, meant that the social savings of having no railroads versus having them actually dropped to only 1.5% of GDP. Peanuts, right? And there's a wonderful set of reviews, of which my favorite comment is the iron horse was the paper tiger of the 19th century, in a nutshell. Now, it's described, the reviewers differ over this. The people who were sympathetic to the project, that is, these new guys, new economic historians, were nevertheless surprised that the number was so small. But the calculations were so grounded in all these facts that it was hard to disagree. And most of the disagreement was really about that he hadn't covered enough of these goods, and he certainly hadn't covered passengers. And other people taking a slightly different date would come up with higher amounts of social saving, because if you count this earlier on, before the railroads have had such an effect, you have more of a difference going on. Now, it's not quite clear where the facts stop and where the fictions begin in this account, because so far it seems like it's all very factual. But it was criticized by the economic historians for using facts constructed from models rather than ones that were found in the archive, or that could in principle have been found in the archive and have got lost, or maybe ones where you could interpolate in between. In other words, there's a fundamental difference going on in this argument between the ones that could have been there and the ones that never were. And where, indeed, were these models? Actually, rereading it, it's pretty hard to see them. They kind of slide in there somewhere. Vogel had actually used what's called a linear programming model to calculate the most efficient use of transport for 1890, for the 1890 economy, with and without railroads. In other words, there's fictions on both sides of this social saving argument, right? Because the linear programming model was used to calculate the most efficient use with the railroads, not the actual use with the railroads. So it wasn't as if he counted what it actually cost to transport goods in 1890. He'd assumed that people could have been more efficient and calculated the most efficient set of routes and the most efficient set of prices that would go along with that and routes. So both sides of this argument between what did happen in 1890 and what could have happened in 1890 without the railroads are both fictional statements. They're both imagined economies. Right? And so there's a kind of sleight of hand there going on in the argument. So the battles over the status of facts and fictions over this counterfactual are not just old versus new economic history, not just a narrative with economic analytics going on versus lots and lots of counting, but an argument between quantitative economic history, which is theoretically informed, and model builders and other counterfactualists who don't want to necessarily be held by what actually happened versus what could, but what should have happened under the most efficient economy with what could have happened. You can see already that there's lots and lots of layers of imagining and fictions going on here. Nevertheless, they're all very, very grounded compared to another counterfactual here. McAfee, whose first name I forget, was an editor of the Economic Review, asked what would have happened by 2000 if Columbus had not discovered America but fell off the edge of the flat Earth. Well, this was clearly a kind of light-hearted takeoff piece. If the railroads did not exist in 1890, they probably do not exist now. There's no record of them being invented in the last 92 years. This is clearly unambiguously a piece of science fiction. And the comment I like best, non-existent railroads are unsafe to use. Well, somehow non-existent railroads seem less daunting than falling off the edge of the flat Earth. But okay, so I put this up in order to make the point about the real difference between the science fiction and this heavily quantitative, fact-based imaginations, that is, an imaginative account of the world as opposed to a science fiction account. So to sort of wrap up this kind of example, Fogel and McAfee both deal with imagined events and do so within imagined worlds. And one could ask, which are the most plausible? Which worlds are more plausible? And here I think one can take advantage of a very nice set of writings by Geoffrey Hawthorne about counterfactuals and about plausible worlds. And he argues that in order to do a sensible counterfactual, you need to choose a sensible nodal point, 1890, which is when most of the railroads have been pretty much filled in. And you shouldn't choose the counterfactual so that you completely rewind the past and rewind the future. Right? So you have to keep as much as possible the same rather than changing everything as McAfee's did. So don't start creating your counterfactual world with theories and models. Start with counterfacts. And only bring in models and theories when you need to help you generate those facts. So the distinction between McAfee and Fogel relies on this kind of idea of plausibility about the importance of these facts. One could say that both Jenks and Fogel give an imaginative description of the world, but they use their imagination and facts at different points in their analysis. I think what I want to draw out of this is to suggest it's less useful to seek a very clear-cut distinction between science fiction and imaginative descriptions. I don't want to put Fogel on the wrong side of this divide, than to ask, where is it that factual and fictional intersect most productively to create these kinds of plausible world accounts that I think Fogel manages to give because it's so grounded in these this factual stuff. So, back to philosophy of science for a minute. Philosophers of science, when they're thinking about models, worry about a traditional problem of representation. How do we know when our model offers a good representation? And this is a problem of assessing the similarity between our model of the world and the world that we live in and we know of. And then how do we use the model to explain things in the world? That is, can we use the model to do more than say, this is a picture of the world, but to actually use it to try and explain things in the world? And in this fictions account, the suggested solutions seem to rely on various kinds of keys, and I'm using this term from Roman Frigg's work, that translate elements of the prescribed fictions onto the facts of the world. So you think of maps, right? So we're thinking about map keys here. Map keys enable you to draw, if you draw a map, you need to key in the kinds of things that you find in the world onto the map. You need to be able to represent on the map with conventional kinds of symbols, the things that we will expect to find in the world. So maps in Britain have beer mugs where they're pubs, but they have round red dots where they're stations, which isn't quite so obvious. Right? But there's a conventional set of things that act as keys which tell us how to read the map, what we're going to find in the world if we know how to read the map. In a sense, though, the problem is you need to know enough about the world to draw the map. Right? You need to have a pretty good idea to draw the map, and often the case with modeling is you don't necessarily know what is actually going on there to draw the map very adequately. I think this key idea works really well for the Fogel example. Right? In Fogel's counterfactual, each set of objects and activities and the final measurements, his counterfacts imagined world, can be easily compared with the world actually happened in 1890. So the keys are there. You can easily make the comparison and therefore make the measurement. It's not obvious that there are always those kind of factual equivalents. it's not obvious that there's the keys that will make those translations between the maps and the things there are in the world. So it may be that the task of modeling is to both create the models and fashion the keys. Let me talk a little bit about the second example, which is where economists imagine markets. And this is a very classic model, which I think many people who are not economists will be familiar with, which is the supply and demand curves, which are upward and downward sloping. Now, each curve, each of these, and the demand curves are the ones sloping upwards to the left and the supply upwards to the right. Each curve shows how economists imagine or hypothesize what consumers and producers imagine that they would buy or sell at the different prices. And prices are measured on the vertical axis and quantities along the horizontal. And what might, in addition, cause these curves to shift? So there's a double level of imagination going on here. Now, okay, it's quite reasonable to assume that this is not such a stupid thing to imagine because people know for their own introspection how they respond to prices. If prices are higher or lower, that they might buy more or less. It's also based on some casual observation of markets, but it's not based on observations of supply and demand curves because those things are not there to be seen in the market. Right? So these are constructed objects, and in addition, there's no scale on this graph. We don't really know what the numbers are. Right? So it's quite significant. They're abstract. They have this abstract quality because they are this abstract conceptual construct. These are standard items in economics. They started off in the mid-19th century, and they're standardly used to ask a whole range of what-if questions. I'm calling them fictional models. And one of the main sets of ways they use is to try and get at facts by using this imagined world model. There's 4 quite substantive different ways in which they're used to understand what kinds of supply and demand facts might be expected by experimenting with versions of this model, this conceptual construct, to define what interesting economic facts implied by the model might or might not exist in the world, and to get at market facts by fitting statistical facts to the fictional curves. That's the development of econometrics, and most of that work is done in the 1920s and 30s. It gets into some very, very technically interesting questions. It's the site in which, if you're an economist, identification is first worked out. It's the site, if you're an economist, where instrumental variables are first used. I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to flag that as being a really important site for the use of this model. It's also the site where the first classroom experiments are done in economics. Chamberlain in 1948, Vernon Smith in 1955 used the model, used the supply and demand curves as a way of creating a classroom experiment to see how markets work. So as a little model, a little constructed abstract model, it's been tremendously important over the last, well, not necessarily still, but between 1850 and 1960 to generate lots and lots of different kinds of quite interesting findings and interesting usage. I want to talk about the first 2 of these just briefly. So here's one of the first sets of these little supply and demand models, established by Alfred Marshall, and his habit was to use these little models of supply and demand in little experiments. So he'd argue about what would happen if supply or if demand rose or fell, or if supply rose or fell. What happens if a tax was put on to the price of the good? What would happen to something called consumer surplus if a tax was put on? So very quickly, he got into quite big questions about ethics and distribution. It's a testing ground for seeing what kinds of things you can learn from this kind of an object in a kind of theoretical domain. So he established this historical way of using a model in an experiment by asking what-if questions. In the top left-hand one, for example, if we assume the supply curve is horizontal, what would happen to price and quantity if our demand curve shifted slightly upwards? Well, you can see that quantity along the horizontal would increase, but price wouldn't change. So each of these little diagrams is a source of many different little experiments about what would happen if this is a picture of the world in that world. Then there's a kind of debate about what's going on here. I mean, there's lots of debates, but the one that I want to focus on is an argument that says these models are empty. It's called the empty economic boxes argument. It pits historians against economists. And you can see that what I've got there is the top 3 of those diagrams. And I've picked the top 3 of those diagrams, each of which has a different shaped supply curve. Right? It's horizontal in the first one, upward sloping in the second one, and downward sloping in the third one. And the argument between Clapham, the economic historian, and Pigou, the economist, Clapham says, well, these diagrams are just part of the mental furniture of the economist. They're not things you're going to find in the world, which I've already suggested. And he says, well, actually, you know, if you go into industry, you're going to go into a factory, like a hat factory, and you're going to find on the shelves of the hat factory lots of boxes with different hats in. But these little objects exist only in the boxes on the shelves of economists' mind. Right? That's the kind of idea that's going on. And he says, actually, they are empty, particularly in the respect of these supply curves, because it's very difficult to actually get any kind of information that would give you these supply curves as observational things. That is, there are no keys in this kind of a case. Those boxes are empty. No keys are possible. A standard hat is not a mathematical concept. Right? So, first of all, the objects we expect to find there are not real objects. Right? In that kind of imagined world in the economist's boxes on his shelves of his mind, we can't put in standard hats. We not only can we not put in standard hats, but there's no easy way, in fact he claims it's impossible, to tell which firms you could collect together to create an industry which would easily fulfill and be pictured as one of these, because these are pictures of industries, not firms at this point. You can't find easily a way of getting together an industry account, description, set of statistics that would fulfill what would give you the shapes of one of these supply curves. It's impossible to measure these things independently of all sorts of other things which are going on. So in other words, these boxes are empty because you just can't go and fill them up. Right? Pigou's response is, well, they're part of the logical machinery which helps you work stuff out in economics, as we've seen with Marshall. And for Pigou even, these boxes on the shelves actually can be subdivided into even smaller little things on the shelves. So not only have you got boxes on the shelves, but you've got sub-boxes inside those boxes. Now, I'm going to skip the other 2 examples of econometrics and experiments, because I want to draw a sort of picture of what I think is going on here, which I think, rather than models as fictions, I prefer to think of models as artifacts. Artifacts are human-made objects. They're creations of materials, but they also typically require some kind of imagination. They potentially contain both factual kinds of things and fictional kinds of things and intuitions and all sorts of stuff. Right? So I think artifacts is a better way to think of these. I think they can include all sorts of fictional objects. For me, these artifacts work as a technology of inquiry. They're experimental objects answering what-if questions to extend the imaginative reach of the modeler and to offer materials that might be, and we've seen how difficult that was in the supply and demand case in the early years, might be keyed to events in the world. Right? So that's the claim I wanted to draw out of these Marshall examples, but also to show how they fit into the final example. It doesn't solve the classic philosophical problems of representation and inferences, but I think it suggests that the experiments with the models actually are more informative in creating the keys that we need than just these similarity problems that are going on. Now, this is the Keynes lecture, so I should mention Keynes, in order to tell you that Keynes was no modeler. He really wasn't. Just to fill in something about Keynes, Keynes' General Theory in 1936 is a very impenetrable book. It's a really difficult book to read. And it's not just me saying that, or my students telling me that. The young economist, the young Turks of the day, when he had written that book, immediately set to and said, what's going on here? We're going to write down some little models, little mathematical models, diagrammatic models, in order to try and figure out what Keynes was trying to say, and whether Keynes was trying to say anything different than had been said before. So for economists here, the famous ISLM curve, drawn by Hicks, is actually an attempt to figure out whether Keynes was saying anything different. And that becomes a standard model to understand Keynesian economics. Here's three other models. On the bottom left is one by Tinbergen, who tried to fit statistics to a Keynesian model in the 1930s. That's the Dutch economy, in order to try and figure out how to get out the Great Depression. Bottom right is by the American Samuelson, who tried to figure out what kinds of answers you could get from a Keynesian system and found almost anything can happen. But I want to talk about the one at the top right, which is a wonderful model called the Phillips machine, usually, but I want to talk about its creation. Because its creation is very interesting. It's a case of splicing lots and lots of facts and fictions together. I'm calling it the Newlin-Phillips machine because it's typically only called the Phillips machine, but in fact, it was jointly built by Phillips and Newlin, and I want to write Newlin back into the history. What we're going to find here is that we've got a combination of observations, and fictions which are intertwined in creating this artifactual model. There are keys that translate both the objects in the model and the outcomes of the experiments. And although the artifact looks like a complete science fiction, it actually behaves more like this kind of imaginative account of the world. Okay, here's our two economists, Phillips on the left. The machine on the left is the Mark II Phillips Newlin machine. It's about 7 foot by 5 foot. It's in the Science Museum. If you want to see it, go to the Computation Gallery. A restored version is in the Science Museum opposite the Babbage machine, which has been built there. It doesn't work, but you can press a button and a video shows you the last time it was worked and was televised by the BBC for a budget report in something like 1993. It's the only economic artifact, as far as I know, in the Science Museum. The one on the right is the first prototype, and you can see here on the far right, Newlin. It's slightly smaller, it's about 5 by 5. You can see it's a report from the Yorkshire Evening Post, because this was first demonstrated, well, properly demonstrated in Leeds, because it was commissioned by Leeds when Newlin was working. And this was picked up by the national press and appeared in the Daily Mirror. Here's a very nice picture which shows you it a little bit more carefully. This is technicians who figured out how to build a copy of the machine from the Free University in Amsterdam. This is a terrible job to do. It's a huge undertaking, and that's no doubt why they're so proudly standing by their machine sometime in the early 1950s, and thanks to Marcel Baumanns, who found this picture. Thank you also, I should say here, to Walter Newlin's family, a couple of whom are here, who provided lots of the information I'm going to use on Walter Newlin here. These two inventors, Walter Newlin and Bill Phillips, both left school with no qualifications. They made their way through the depressed 1930s world. They fought in the Second World War, Newlin in signalling, Phillips in electrical engineering. Newlin was in the Royal Corps of Signals, expert in communications equipment, evacuated in the last days from Dunkirk on a fishing smack, and served then in India. Phillips worked in the Air Force on aircraft systems. He was taken prisoner of war by the Japanese, and there's some wonderful stories about clandestine radio systems which he managed to keep going. And why did the lights dim just before lights out? Because he'd managed to figure out how the soldiers could get themselves hot tea, and the Japanese never quite figured out how he'd done that. They returned from the war. They'd both done some evening classes at LSE before the war. They went to the London School of Economics as returning veterans and made friends there. And the traditional story, as I've said, has written Newlin out. And I think it's very important to bring him back in because of his experience in the 1930s. In the 1930s, he started off as a very junior clerk to Darlings, the big Australian grain merchants, and he worked his way up to be the chartering clerk on the Baltic Exchange for them. This is the picture of the Baltic Exchange. These are sacks of grain here. He wasn't the trader. He was the person writing the charters and the contracts. The Baltic Exchange then was not just an exchange for grain trading, it was also the major exchange trading freight. Right? So actually, if you wanted to carry something around the world in a freighter, you would come and make a contract on the Baltic Exchange. And he was writing all these contracts. So he really understood how money goes around the system. Because he was right there sending cargoes around the world and writing the contracts for the monetary exchanges. And here's an extract from his theory of money. Take, for example, the case of a large-scale merchanting firm disposing of a bulk cargo of grain purchased abroad. Having received the cheque at 2:45 p.m., a messenger will have deposited it at the merchant's bank at 2:50. The messenger then proceeds around the corner and at 2:55 deposits a cheque for the same amount drawn in his firm's bank account to one of the London discount houses. Moreover, he's probably passed in his walk a messenger of the buying firm who has collected a cheque of a similar amount from another discount house deposited at the buyer's bank at 2:45. Right? It's all done within 10 minutes. All this money is being moved around. Right? That's what Newlyn is setting in action during his chartering clerk's days. He's sending these messengers out, moving money around. Bill Phillips has a very different experience, and in some sense, he grew up inside a hydraulic machine. This is an account from his sister. He grew up in a New Zealand dairy farm in the North Island, in a very rural area which had no electricity and was a pretty primitive kind of place. And their parents, not just their father, but their mother was equally important here, it turns out, in organising the stream that ran through their plot to give them electricity, give them a flush toilet. And this is a description of how much they lived at the mercy or under the control of this hydraulic system. Lights out. So we have these two individuals, right, who've grown up with very different experiences, coming together, making friends at the LSE, spending time with each other, going on walks, going to the theatre, and meeting over the refectory table and whatever. They invent the machine together. And there's three important steps here. Phillips transforms the standard economics demands of supply, which I just showed you, to domestic plumbing. I'm going to show you these three steps. Newlyn develops the blueprint for this hydraulic machine, which you've seen in the first set of slides. They build the prototype Newlyn-Phillips machine. So over quite a short period, a few months in the summer of 1949, they moved from this metaphor of somehow money is like water to an analogical machine, and they actually build this hydraulic machine. At the same time, they're splicing a lot of their own experiences of hydraulics and money into how the machine works and how it works as a particular artifact. Here's the first step, Phillips' undergraduate essay. He wrote an undergraduate essay in 1949 where he took that standard supply and demand model and said, well, actually, it's a little bit odd here. We don't, what's on the horizontal axis? Is it quantities of something, or is it flow per unit of time? Well, we could just about put them on both the same diagram on the right, but if the stocks aren't constant, we really have a problem in using this kind of diagram to explain what's going on, to figure out what's going on. So he took the advantage of a recent textbook by Kenneth Balding, who'd given a domestic plumbing example, the cistern for a lavatory, to show how one might get stocks and flows working together. And he designed his own version of that here on the bottom right, which is obviously drawn a lot from the Balding example. Now, Newlyn, the second half of this paper, is not a very good account of the macroeconomics problem. He really doesn't understand the macro, and in fact, it's really quite obvious that he's got something interesting on the micro side, the supply and demand side, but he doesn't understand this problem of how you move from that to an economy, a macroeconomy, economy of the whole system, and its monetary accounts. Newlyn, who is his friend, is showing this this undergraduate essay that Martin Slater was given, Newlin's son-in-law, and kept it because he was so interested in it. He thought this idea of making an hydraulic account of the economy was just the way to go. And in fact, he'd already in 1947, in his own undergraduate essays, played around with an idea of an hydraulic sort of process for monetary system, but hadn't got very far with it. So his hydraulics isn't so good, but he showed really he understood the professional literature in macro. He knew all of the 1930s literature on macro, which was still the sake of the arguments in the 1940s. So he took that idea and turned it into a blueprint. I'm sorry, this is a very bad copy, but this was the blueprint he drew. It's on an A5 sheet, so it was cut in half in order to be stored. It was taken to Leeds to persuade the Leeds department, where Newlin was already a lecturer, to fund the building of this hydraulic machine. It's got some tanks in the bottom left. You've got a kind of open system here. It looks a bit like the machine I showed you earlier, but I'm going to explain it better in a diagram that's going to come in a minute. Here's them constructing the machine. Newlin still in somehow some army gear here. And they celebrated the moment when they built the first tank. They felt like it was a sort of foundation moment in the summer of 1949. So Phillips in the doorway is the superior engineer. Newlin outside is the superior economist. And they're getting together and putting all their knowledge sets together to build this machine. Here's a drawing of the machine built to market this machine. It was marketed around the world. A number of central banks and companies bought this machine in the 1950s. I've shown this because it's very difficult to see what's happening on a photograph. But here, I think you can see there's a sort of circular flow. The channel up the left-hand side is the income flow going up. When it starts coming down in the middle, it divides itself. And the first thing that comes off on the left is taxes. Consumption goes down the center part, investment comes off on the right-hand side, and then exports and imports in the external sector are shown underneath that. There's a number of tanks there, each of which hold different stocks of money. So the economy is pictured, all the bits of the Keynesian economy are pictured in terms of the macro income, the income of us in aggregate, our expenditure in aggregate, our consumption in aggregate, our imports and exports, our savings, our taxes, and so forth. Now, this looks in lots of ways like an implausible kind of science fiction. It looks more like a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy kind of object. But in fact, it turns out to be able to tell us quite a lot of plausible stories about the world as it went on in the 1950s. And a lot of those plausibility hangs not on the fact that we've got keys from the objects to the world, we can tell you what those things all are, but the fact that it does lots and lots of what-if experiments. Right? You can set the levels of money in the tanks, you can change the little square slides with the functions in them that control the valves, you can unhook bits of the machine and hook it back up, you can even link two machines, so you can have an international economy and have America and Britain linked up. You can try out all sorts of policy actions. It acts as a computer, which is why it's in the Science Museum as a computer. And every time you do a run with an experimental setup, the outcomes are charted in graphs on the top right-hand side, which shows you what happens to income over time. And as it turns out, there's some implausible stories, but there's also some quite plausible stories that come out of these experiments. It's, in fact, a very, very subtle model, right? And its plausibility depends on a lot of that subtlety. Stocks and flows are really working together here, which is what Phillips was worried about. You have to assume that stocks and flows really do work in the economy. That's what Phillips was trying to get at. The time delays in the system, or the lack of them, which is what Newlin was really concerned about and really understood from his chartering clerk days, and they really matter because it takes time for an experiment to work its way through the system, right? And that time can be calibrated in certain respects. It has a continuous and sequential pattern of circulation. It gives you a real dynamics rather than a set of comparative static points, which is what many models were doing. And it interacts in the system in a real way as opposed to just imagining that they're working. Although, of course, it's in such a different medium that one can still think this is a pretty strange model. Okay. It generates a whole set of cartoons. This is a cartoon that Emmett did in Punch. He clearly has seen the machine. He ran this on budget day in 1953. It's an economy that runs on cold tea, and I wish you could read all the small print because there's really wonderful descriptions in there. In the 1970s and 80s, economists got embarrassed by this machine and put it away in cupboards. Recently, it's been a lot more, it's been restored in various places, so somehow now it's become an icon of some kind of an age. But this is the cartoon that generates, every now and again, a new cartoon. For instance, the 2008 financial crisis, the cover story on The Economist is just such another takeoff of the Emmett, which is a takeoff of this wonderful Heath Robinson kind of machine. Again, it's full of wonderful detail, which it would be nice to be able to discuss, but it's pretty incoherent, I think. But maybe in 2008, economists probably didn't have a terribly coherent account of what was going on. Okay, what I want to draw out of this and to finish with is to think about the importance and the value of the what-if questions. If we look at these examples here and what economists do with what-if questions, I think what we get a sense of is that the model usage, not necessarily the creation, but the usage, depends critically on asking what-if questions. And those creations and uses depend on a lot of crossings over between facts and fictions in modeling, just as games of fictions do, right? There's a lot of stuff which goes backwards and forwards between facts, fictions, facts, and so forth. Depends on creating these kind of artifacts that have a flexible status where economists can use them to have thought experiments, if you like, to explore their theories, to think about what would happen if the world was like this, but also to think about what actually does happen when you can put facts and statistics onto these models. And they do so with this technology of inquiry that comes from this artifactual status. Imagination is critical in this cognitive use of models, both in creating and using them. And I think what I hope comes out of this is that the plausibility of this doesn't rest so much on the object, because some of these objects look pretty bizarre, like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy problem, but they rest much more firmly on the kind of what-if questions that are used in the model and the kind of claims that come with the what-if questions rather than about the fictional or factual status of the model. So it's not whether the model is a fiction or factual or artifact or whatever. It's to do with the plausibility of the accounts that you can get out from them, even when some of these accounts look a priori very much having a fictional kind of status. Thank you.